I decided that moving to Dalesville would mark the beginning of a new life. This little town, with its quiet streets and cozy houses, smelled of freshness and nature and seemed like the perfect place to start over. Daniel and I had dreamed of this: new house, new opportunities, even a new sense of purpose. But as soon as I began unpacking the boxes, something inside clicked, and I felt trapped in this silent space. Daniel immediately dove into his work, consumed by projects, while I was left alone in our new home, surrounded by empty rooms, trying to find a sense of purpose within myself. The days passed in a blur, each one feeling heavier than the last. I watched the world go by through the window, the town's calmness only deepening my unease. I told myself it would get better once I settled in, but each day felt more distant from the dream I had imagined. Dalesville, with its idyllic charm, became a place that reminded me of what I had left behind, not of the future I had hoped for. Daniel's absence seemed to stretch the silence further. He came home late, tired, and distant. Dinner became a ritual of empty words, and I felt as though I were living with a stranger. There were moments when I found myself yearning for something, anything that would break the monotony. But when I searched for it, I found nothing. Only the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the steady pulse of my own loneliness. One day, I decided to take a walk around the town. Maybe it would help, I thought. I wandered through narrow streets, passing small cafes that smelled of freshly brewed coffee and shops that seemed to hold their own quiet secrets. The lake was just a short walk from the town center, and as I reached its edge, I felt a momentary sense of peace. The water whispered softly against the shore, and for a brief second, I let myself believe that maybe this place could offer me something new. But deep down, I knew that what I was searching for wasn't here, not yet. The quiet lake, the chirping birds, the little shops, it was all so peaceful, but it felt like a mask. Underneath there was a stirring, an emptiness that had yet to be filled. I had moved here to escape, but I wasn't sure what I was really running from anymore, or what I was running towards. The longer I stayed alone, the more withdrawn I became. The town, with all its charm, felt increasingly like a stage where I was just another quiet face in the crowd. I had hoped for a fresh start, but instead I felt like I was drowning in a sea of mundane routines. Daniel seemed lost in his work, and I, in turn, found myself sinking deeper into isolation. I kept myself busy with small tasks, cleaning, organizing, trying to make the house feel like home. But no matter how much I tried, it never felt like enough. I would spend hours folding clothes or rearranging books, only to find myself staring out the window again, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. When Daniel would come home, he was tired, his mind already miles away. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, but it felt as though we were strangers, living parallel lives without ever really crossing paths. Dinner became a hollow ritual. We'd sit across from each other, the clink of silverware and the soft hum of the television filling the spaces between us. I tried to engage him in conversation, but his responses were curt, distracted. The man I had once known, the man who had shared my dreams of this new life, was slipping away from me, lost in a world I didn't belong to. I found myself talking to the walls more often than to him. It wasn't that I didn't love him. I did. But in this quiet house, in this peaceful town, I felt as though I had lost a part of myself. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. Was it the move? Was it him? Or was it just me, the version of myself that had never quite fit into this new life? One evening, I decided to go out, just to get away from the walls that felt like they were closing in on me. I slipped on my coat and stepped into the cool night air. The streets were empty, the sky clear and full of stars. I wandered through the town, not really knowing where I was going, but hoping that somehow the walk would clear my head. The streets, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, felt so different in the evening, quieter, almost secretive. I ended up at the lake again, its surface calm and still. I sat on a bench, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. The sound of the water was soothing, but again, the emptiness crept in. I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this town than just its surface beauty, more than the silence that seemed to settle over everything. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I was meant to find something here, something that would fill the void I felt inside. But what? What was it that I was truly seeking? That night, as I made my way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life here, in this peaceful place, was beginning to unravel in ways I couldn't quite understand. The quiet, the calm. It all seemed like a lie now, a mask hiding something deeper, something I had yet to confront. A few days later, I found myself wandering again, but this time I ended up at a small winery on the outskirts of town. It was a family-owned place, and the locals had spoken of it in passing. The vines stretched out in front of me, and the scent of earth and fresh grapes filled the air. I had no intention of stopping, but something about the quiet beauty of the place made me hesitate just long enough to walk inside. Behind the counter was James. He looked up with a smile, and something about his warm, easy demeanor immediately made me feel at ease. He introduced himself, and, as we began talking, I realized how easy it was to open up to him. His questions were simple, but they felt real, like he genuinely cared about my answers. I shared more than I had with anyone in the last few months. He invited me on a tour of the winery, and I agreed. As we walked through the vineyard, James spoke about his family's history with wine, the challenges of maintaining the vines, and the connection between the land and the wine. I was captivated by his passion. There was something magnetic about him, something that made me forget about the loneliness I had been carrying. By the time I left, I realized that for the first time since moving to Dalesville, I felt lighter, more alive. James had made me feel heard, something I hadn't realized I was missing so badly. What this encounter meant, I wasn't sure, but it was a spark, something I hadn't felt in a long time. As the days went by, I found myself returning to the winery, more often than I cared to admit. Every visit with James felt like a small escape from the life I was growing increasingly dissatisfied with. Each conversation was different, yet they all seemed to fill the spaces inside me that had been empty for so long. James had a way of listening that was rare. He didn't just hear me, he understood. As we sat together, sipping wine by the lake or walking through the rows of vines, I began to share more than I had with anyone in years. I talked about my past, my feelings of being lost, and the quiet desperation that had taken root in my life since moving to Dalesville. James never judged. He just listened, his steady gaze softening as if to say he understood, even when I didn't have the words to explain. In return, he told me about his own life, his struggles with finding his place in the world, and the challenges of keeping the winery afloat. But what stood out to me most was how open he was, how vulnerable he allowed himself to be with me. In those moments, we weren't just two people passing time. We were two souls, connecting on a level I hadn't known I needed. The sunsets over the vineyard became our quiet ritual. The sky would change, shifting from orange to pink to purple, and we'd sit in silence, watching the world around us as if time had slowed just for us. There was something about those moments that felt right. The simplicity of our time together, the way we both existed in that space without needing to say much, was more than enough. The attraction between us grew, not in a rush, but in quiet moments, in the spaces between words. I found myself drawn to him in a way that was both unexpected and undeniable. It wasn't just his smile or his stories, but something deeper. The way he made me feel seen, as though I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. As the days passed, I realized that I was beginning to feel something more than just friendship, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. The more time I spent with James, the more I found myself questioning the life I had with Daniel. And yet, the guilt weighed heavily on me. The loyalty I had once felt seemed to slip further away, replaced by a new, confusing pull toward someone else. And I didn't know how to stop it. It was a quiet afternoon when it happened. James had invited me to join him for another walk along the lake, and I couldn't resist. The familiar pull of his presence had become almost magnetic. We walked in silence at first, our footsteps soft against the earth, the air warm with the promise of summer. We reached the edge of the water, and James stopped. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, everything around us seemed to fade away. The world became smaller, just the two of us standing there, in that perfect, silent space. His gaze held mine, intense, yet calm, and I felt a flutter in my chest. It was as though something unspoken was passing between us, something both heavy and light at the same time. And then, without warning, he stepped closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest as he leaned in, his presence overwhelming, and I knew, without a doubt, that this moment was different. I had felt something like this before, but never quite so clearly, never so undeniably. His lips brushed mine gently at first, testing the waters, and then, as though he had waited for me to respond, he kissed me deeper, with a quiet intensity that took my breath away. The world around us disappeared. There was no Dalesville, no vineyard, no house with empty rooms. There was just him, just this kiss, and the rawness of the connection between us. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. In that instant, I knew everything had changed. I knew that what I had felt for Daniel, what I thought was love, wasn't enough anymore. I had stepped into something new, something that felt real and raw and undeniable. The guilt hit me like a wave, crashing over me in the same instant that the warmth of James's touch settled in my skin. But for that brief moment, it didn't matter. For once, I wasn't alone. I wasn't invisible. I was seen. I was wanted, and it felt like everything I had been longing for. As we pulled away, I looked into his eyes, and in that look, I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. It was more than just attraction. It was a connection, something that neither of us could ignore. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel lost. But as soon as the kiss ended, reality came rushing back. The quiet lake, the vineyard, the soft rustling of the trees. It was all still there, but the weight of what I had just done lingered in the air like a storm about to break. The days following that kiss with James were a blur of confusion and guilt. Every time I saw him, I felt that same pull, that same undeniable attraction. But each moment spent with him only deepened the ache in my chest, reminding me of the commitment I had made to Daniel. The person I had built a life with, the one I was supposed to love and care for, was still out there, oblivious to the storm that was brewing within me. Daniel began to notice the change. It was subtle at first. He came home earlier, his eyes scanning the house, his posture tense. He started asking questions, little things at first. Why was I out so much? Who had I been talking to? The questions were harmless, but I could feel the weight of his suspicion growing. And I knew it wasn't just my physical absence that was bothering him, but the emotional distance that had begun to widen between us. One evening, I returned home from yet another visit to the winery. The house felt colder than usual, and the silence was heavier. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him, eyes locked on mine as soon as I walked through the door. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew this was it. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. But his eyes, those eyes that had once looked at me with affection, were now filled with something darker, something I couldn't ignore. I hesitated, trying to form words that would make sense of the chaos in my mind. But nothing came. I couldn't lie to him, not anymore. The truth had been gnawing at me, a constant presence, and I knew that if I didn't face it now, it would consume me. "I've been seeing someone," I finally admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "James, he's the owner of the winery." Daniel's face hardened. The silence between us stretched, unbearable. I watched as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something I had never seen before: betrayal. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. It was as though the weight of what I had just confessed was too much for him to process. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracked with hurt. I didn't have an answer. How could I explain the pull I felt toward James? How could I make sense of the emptiness I had been carrying, the way he made me feel seen when Daniel hadn't in so long? I don't know, I stammered. I don't feel like myself anymore. I felt lost for so long, and then I met him, and it felt like I was alive again. Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and for a moment, I thought he might walk away. He looked at me, a mix of anger and pain in his eyes. "You've destroyed everything," he said through clenched teeth. "Everything we built, everything I trusted, it's gone. Because of him." The words hit me like a slap. My chest tightened, and I felt the weight of what I had done, crushing me from the inside. Daniel wasn't angry with me alone. He was angry with himself, with the life we had built that now seemed so fragile, so easily broken. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I whispered, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were empty. I had already made my choice. Daniel turned away, his shoulders tense, and I watched him walk out of the room without saying another word. He left, and I was left alone with the crushing weight of my actions. James had made me feel alive, but in doing so, I had destroyed the life I had once cherished, and now I had to face the consequences of that choice. After Daniel left, I didn't know what to do. The house was still, silent, and the weight of his words hung in the air like a cloud. I had never seen him like this before, so hurt, so angry. He had been the steady presence in my life, the one I could count on, the one who had always believed in us. And now, in an instant, everything had shattered. I found myself sitting in the living room, my hands trembling as I clutched the empty wine glass I hadn't even realized I was holding. The room felt colder than it had before, and the walls, once comforting, now seemed like they were closing in around me. The quiet that had once seemed peaceful now felt suffocating. I tried calling James, needing to hear his voice, needing to feel that spark again, but he didn't answer. Maybe it was for the best, I thought. Maybe I needed to face the reality of what I had done, but even in my guilt, I couldn't ignore the longing that pulsed in my chest, the longing for something that was more than just a fleeting moment of comfort. I didn't sleep that night. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity as I replayed everything over and over in my mind. Daniel's face, his disbelief, the pain in his eyes, and then my own actions, the kiss with James, the moments of connection I had so foolishly allowed myself to believe could fill the emptiness inside me. I had never felt so small, so lost. I had tried to escape my own feelings, to run from the discontent that had slowly built inside me, but in doing so, I had ruined everything. The life I had with Daniel, the one that I thought would be my anchor, was slipping through my fingers and I had no idea how to stop it. The morning came, gray and cold, and I was left with nothing but regret. I went into the kitchen trying to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the reality I had created, but the silence in the house was deafening. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze, unsure of what to expect. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew, without even checking, that it was James. I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the threshold. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something I couldn't quite place. Concern, maybe, or pity. I wasn't sure. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but soft. I stepped aside to let him in, and as he crossed the threshold, I felt a strange sense of finality. There was no going back. The moment we crossed paths again, I knew my life had irrevocably changed. James stood in front of me, the very thing that had caused this rift, yet the one I couldn't bring myself to regret, no matter how much it hurt. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us unsure of how to begin. Finally, James spoke. "I don't want to be the reason your marriage falls apart," he said, his voice low. "But I can't ignore what's between us either." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I wanted to hear him say what I thought he was going to say. "I think we both need time to figure this out," he continued, his gaze softening. I don't want you to make decisions out of guilt or confusion. Whatever happens next, I want it to be because it's what you truly want. As he left the house, I was left alone again, standing at the door, torn between the life I had broken and the one I had begun to build with someone else. The world outside felt as cold and distant as it had when I first arrived in Dalesville, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now more lost than I had ever been. One morning, I went to the lake to think. The quiet of the water soothed me, even as my mind raced. I felt a pull toward both the past and the future, yet neither seemed to offer peace. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. I turned, and there was Daniel, standing at the edge of the path. His face was unreadable, his voice quiet. I didn't know where else to go. I'm sorry, I whispered, but the words felt hollow. I don't know what to do with this, he said, his eyes pained. I don't know if I can forgive you. The truth hit me. There was no way back, no easy answers. We need time, he added softly, before turning away and walking off.